Jack, a 12-year-old boy living in poverty, has to wander the busy streets every day to sell small packages of candy. Although his thin shoulders carried the burden of life, he still walked tenaciously, not allowing himself to fall. Jack's eyes contained hope, but there was also a deep sadness in the face of cold, contemptuous stares from passers-by. The boy was too used to being ignored and ridiculed by wealthy people, when his requests to buy me a package of candy were just like whispers in the air. No one noticed. Despite this, Jack did not cry, did not fall. Instead, his eyes lit up with a glint of patience, like an invisible source of motivation that helped him overcome all disdain and coldness. The people around him might look at him with contempt, but Jack understood that life wasn't always easy and that he was used to feeling sorry for himself. He kept walking, step by step steadily on the crowded street, with the small hope that one day, his life would change. When Jack stopped in front of Luna's gold shop, he couldn't take his eyes off the glittering jewelry inside. The light from the rings, necklaces, and gemstones reflected through the glass made the space brilliant. But for Jack, it was also a completely different world, a world he had never entered. He felt like a lost child, standing in the middle of a luxurious space that he had no right to touch. Although he only wanted to sell a few packages of candy, he couldn't help but clearly feel the difference between himself and the people inside the shop. Jack's thin little steps seemed heavy as he approached the door, his heart pounding incessantly, wondering if he really belonged to this place. Every time he looked at the luxuries, he felt a loneliness, a clear deprivation in his life. But then, for some reason, he still stood there, watching everything, partly out of curiosity, partly out of a desire to change his fate, even though he knew it could be very far away. Mrs. White, a chic woman with a perfect appearance, walked into the Luna Gold shop, attracting the attention of everyone around. With a designer bag and high heels, she shows the power and arrogance that everyone in the salon respects. Underneath that facade, however, was a cold calculation, a plan hidden in her sharp eyes. When the staff in the salon are busy serving, Mrs. White not only enjoys the beauty of the jewelry, but also calculates carefully. She picked up the necklaces, turning them gently in her hand as if she was feeling every detail. But the truth was that she was watching, waiting for an opportunity. When people weren't paying attention, she quickly committed the theft. The glittering necklace disappeared into her coat pocket, unnoticed. Although her appearance did not change, her gaze flashed over Jack when he accidentally saw her, but she remained calm. In that moment, Mrs. White did not feel guilty, but on the contrary, she was confident that no one would be able to detect her actions. As Jack stood outside the gold shop, his gaze suddenly stopped when he saw Mrs. White, the chic woman, quickly putting the necklace in her coat pocket in a skillful and sophisticated way. The boy felt his heart tighten, a feeling of coldness and insecurity enveloping his entire body. At first, Jack didn't dare to believe what he had just witnessed. He wondered if his eyes had deceived him. But no, the truth is very clear. Mrs. White, with her elegant and proud appearance, was the one who stole the precious jewel. Jack felt a sense of bewilderment and fear, but he couldn't ignore the wrong action he had just discovered. Although his hands were shaking, his small legs seemed to be tightly closed in place, but a certain force urged Jack to do something. He couldn't stand still and watch the incident unfold without speaking. With thoughts swirling in his head, anxiety and determination torn in his heart, Jack finally decided to rush into the gold shop, shouting decisively, "Stop! She stole the necklace!" His voice rang out, sharp and determined, like a bell that broke the silence of space. The feeling of tension, anxiety, and courage made Jack's heart pound, but he couldn't turn back. He pointed directly at Mrs. White's pocket, knowing that he was facing danger, but also knowing that the right action was the only thing he could do right now. When Jack saw the necklace stolen by Mrs. White, a sense of insecurity rose in him, but at the same time, there was also a strong feeling that compelled him to take action. Although he was a poor boy, standing in front of a luxurious, powerful woman like Mrs. White, Jack could not ignore it. He felt his heart beating harder than ever, each beat urging him to speak up. His hands trembled, his legs seemed to be tightly closed, but a determination rose in him. He couldn't let Mrs. White cheat on people without being caught. Although he was full of anxiety in his heart, he still took a deep breath, stepped forward and shouted decisively, "Stop! She stole the necklace." His voice echoed in the quiet space of the gold shop, breaking the silence, causing all eyes to fall on Jack. He knew he had attracted attention, but at this moment, nothing could stop him. Though frightened and trembling, Jack pointed to the pocket of Mrs. White's coat, ignoring the glances around him. He could feel the tension emanating from everyone, but in his heart, Jack had only one feeling: right. He did what he had to do, and although no one might believe him, he spoke up to defend the truth. When she heard Jack scream, Mrs. White remained calm, but in her eyes, a cold glint flashed. Although the boy's accusations sounded like a bell in the middle of a quiet space, she did not show any confusion. Instead, she turned to look at Jack with a smirk full of contempt, as if she didn't believe that a poor child like him would dare to criticize her. Her gaze was sharp and calculating, trying to maintain her perfect appearance, but in her heart, she felt the tension mounting. The feeling of being threatened made her angry, but she didn't show any anxiety, but just coldly retorted, "What is this boy talking about?" Her words were cold and arrogant, as if the accusations were not worthy of her attention. When everyone around her began to whisper, Mrs. White did not panic and continued to remain calm, even though her heart was more worried than ever. The feeling of being discovered made her feel a little urgent, but she still managed to hide her anxiety in her cold eyes and smile. Even when the goldsmith hesitated and prepared to check, she hurriedly interrupted them, appearing stern and confident. "Are you suspicious of me, just because of a strange child?" Mrs. White felt more and more threatened by Jack, but she never thought that such a poor child could hurt her. Silence enveloped the gold shop space as soon as Jack's accusation sounded. Everyone stood stunned, their eyes focused on the thin boy, whose face was flushed with tension. The air became suffocating, as if time had stopped, all waiting for what would happen next. The surrounding sounds seemed to disappear, leaving only the sound of Jack's soft breathing and his heartbeat pounding in his chest. Mrs. White, though she tried to remain calm, could not hide the fleeting surprise in her eyes. Everyone in the shop, from the staff to the customers, did not dare to speak up, as if they could not believe what had just happened. The surprise made everyone confused, not knowing how to react. Jack stood there, his hand still pointing at Mrs. White, while his gaze was determined, unwavering. Everyone waited. No one dared to act, but the silence further highlighted the tension that was spreading throughout the space, like a storm about to hit. As the silence faded, the atmosphere in the gold shop began to become more tense than ever. Everyone still stood stunned, their eyes fixed on Jack, as if waiting for some kind of change. But no one spoke, and Mrs. White kept a cold countenance, though her heart was constantly shaking. Feelings of anxiety and anger rose in her, but she could not let herself be exposed in front of everyone's eyes. She continued to maintain her confidence, but her sharp eyes could not hide the confusion inside. Meanwhile, Jack stood there, his hand pointing directly at her, his eyes shining resolutely. He was no longer afraid, although he knew that he was facing a powerful woman, but the truth had prompted him to speak up. Each step Mrs. White took toward the door made Jack's heart beat faster. As she began to walk, part of Jack wanted to turn back, but the rest of it was his integrity and courage that urged him not to retreat. In that moment, he felt as if there was an invisible power that helped him maintain his determination. Jack did what he had to do, and although he didn't know if anyone would believe him, he stood up for the truth, despite all the hardships and fears. He felt the change in himself, feeling like he had grown up more than ever.